begin with our today's talk about critiquing a research article. A very important skill for researchers uh, to critically review a research article, right? So, in this presentation, we are going to talk about two different types of articles that we can review critically. We will talk about what sort of information we include when we uh, critically review articles. We will also discuss the structure of a critique that we write and some basic questions to address and some critical questions to answer in our effort to review a research article uh, critically, right? Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. Right, so there are two types of articles. One is uh, called empirical articles. The other could be review of literature, or some people call them theoretical article, right? Empirical article is the one which is basically based on a study, an empirical study, where the researchers uh, take different steps to collect data or to design data collection tools, collect data, analyze data, then present data, and do the discussion part, discuss the data, etc. That's called an empirical article or a research article. A review article is basically, or sometimes it is called a meta-analysis of a review of literature or literature. That type of an article won't have the sections like methodology or design or findings, etc. In a review article, you will find a review of the literature on a specific topic in a specific area, right? So both of them can be reviewed critically. You can write a critique on both. But the first one, which is an empirical article, probably it's the most common one where we critique it for research purposes. So when you review your literature for your project, you will have to use that critical eye. You will have to read critically the different aspects of the papers. For example, to what extent you think the review is descriptive, to what extent you think the review is critical, analytical, etc. Different questions you will have to ask, and we'll talk about these questions later. Um, a critical review of literature is a challenging task for students. I remember for my PhD, I wrote or I rewrote the chapter probably 4 times, the lit review chapter I'm talking about, because it's one of the most challenging tasks to write a review of literature in a critical way, right? So both these articles can be reviewed critically, and both of them will lead to different questions, critical questions. We'll be discussing those questions in a while, right? So we have two types of articles, empirical ones and theoretical ones. Okay, when we start our review, a critical review or a critique, we should consider the following information, the basic information. For instance, the name or the names of the authors, the first thing. The second, the title of the article that we choose, the title of the journal or the name of the journal, the volume number, the date, the publication date, the month, the year, and the page numbers. Okay, these things are usually found on the front page, and so you don't need to go deep in the research article. The front page will tell you about the name, the title, etc. Underneath the title, you usually find the abstract, the summary of the whole article, and in that abstract you can sometimes find a statement of the problem or issue discussed. If you can't find it in the abstract, you will definitely find it in the introduction to the article, introduction section, which is the first section of a research article, right? The introduction section will also tell you about the author's purpose, the methods, the hypotheses, and the major conclusions. The abstract usually talks about these things as well. Abstract is a bit brief, like 150 to 250 words long, but it does include the aim of the study, the participants, the methodology, the major findings, conclusion, etc. So this is basically the first section of your critique, or I would say the first paragraph of your critique, right? In this first section of your critique, you will include the name, the title of the journal, the statement, problem, and the purpose of the author, approach, methods, etc. That will be the first section. Do you understand? Okay, and that first section, well, with that section we begin our critique, right? So that will be considered as an introduction. And in that introduction section, you will include these 5 key points that I have just discussed. Right. Then you will start organizing the body of your critique according to the paper structure. In a typical research article, you will find abstract, introduction, literature review, methodology, findings or results, discussion of the findings, and conclusion. So you got 7 things. It means there would be 7 major sections in one typical research article. And in those 7 sections, you know, there will be different sort of stuff, and you'll have to critically review that. So your critique will be according to the structure of the papers. It means your critique will be divided into 7 sections as well. So you will be critiquing each and every section separately, right? So you start with a brief description and analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the research design and methodology. The point is, when we say critique, students usually confuse it for weaknesses, but it includes both the strengths and the weaknesses. So you can begin with the abstract. Basically, if the abstract is a well-written one, it includes the key points. The writer has maintained a standard. Then the introduction talks about the problem. The writer has properly problematized the problem, contextualized the problem. The aims of the research, they are quite clear. The objectives are there. The research questions are linked to the research aims, etc. So that's the introduction part. If it meets the basic criteria, you can say, well, it's okay. If something is missing, then you can point out those weaknesses. So you talk about the strengths and weaknesses both simultaneously, right? Similarly, about the literature review, if it's too descriptive, it's a weakness. If it's descriptive plus critical, then it's a strength. If the studies are kind of outdated, so you can say, well, it's one of the weakness. If there's a sort of balance, the cited studies are from like 2010 as well as from 2018 and 19 and 20. So you can say it's a sort of balance, and it's a very well written literature review, something like that. So a methodology section, and then the findings and the conclusion, all the sections can be critically reviewed, and you can talk about them in different ways. Important point is that you use headings and subheadings for each section. For instance, methodology, findings, discussion, conclusion. You should use headings to structure your critique. In each section, provide enough descriptive information so that your review will be clear to a reader who may not have read the study. That's why the introduction part is very important, where you include a kind of summary of the whole research paper as well, like the aims, the researcher's goals, the objectives, etc. Because that part gives the readers an overview of the whole study. Being a researcher or being a writer, you definitely read the paper first, from A to Z. So you got the first-hand information, but a reader will probably not have the basic information about your research, about the paper that you're critically reviewing. So it's important to provide descriptive information wherever it's required, right? You need to be, that's very important. You need to be objective in your approach, balanced, unbiased, and you should support your critique with examples. If you say, for instance, the literature review is descriptive, it's not critical, then you should give example. From there, you can quote, you can refer to a particular section, particular sentence, particular paragraph, right? You shouldn't make empty claims. No, there should be a claim supported with an example. You should keep a balanced opinion, and your subjective opinion can be harmful. It can, you know, it can give an impression that you're not really objective or impartial, right? You balance your analysis to include both strengths and weaknesses, as I said earlier, and you justify your criticism by giving examples of the study's weaknesses and strengths. Whenever you discuss the strengths or weaknesses, in both cases, you got to give examples from there, from the article that you review. You refer to the section, a particular paragraph, or whatever the case may be. You understand? It's about the structure of a critique. And the most important point is that you structure your critique according to the paper that you are reviewing and use headings. Is it clear? Okay. Um, you conclude your analysis by briefly summing up the strengths and weaknesses of the study by assessing its contribution to the field of knowledge, theory, practice, and consider suggesting research directions and methodological considerations for future researchers. Now, of course, you include one section that is called conclusion, but you're critiquing the conclusion of the researcher or the paper that you're reviewing. But you can have a separate section in your critique, a kind of a reflective section, where you can include your personal views, observation about the article, right? You can have your own say. You can talk about the strengths and weaknesses briefly. You summarize the whole thing. You give future directions. You can comment on the importance and significance of the study, uh, whether it's really contributing to the theory and practice or not, right? So that final section would be a sort of reflective section that could be somehow subjective, not a great deal, but still you can have it a little subjective, right? You can use well. This is very important. You shouldn't mix up the tenses. You should either use past tense or present tense, but consistently, right? When you refer to the completed that completed research paper that you are reviewing. Check if your discipline has a preference, but in our case, social sciences and education in particular, we will use most probably simple tense, present simple tense, right? you should stick to a standard citation style. And again, for educationists or people in our profession, now they will be using APA, American Psychological Association. A lot of stuff available online. If you just Google APA referencing style, you can download that PDF document from the official website, or you can watch few videos online on YouTube to know how to use or make the best use of APA in your research. Students usually make mistakes when they often mix up APA and MLA and Chicago referencing styles, right? But we use APA in the field of TESOL and applied linguistics. You should learn about APA more, right? These are a few tips regarding the structure of a critique. Any questions? Okay. Right, so now we talked about the structure, a few important points that we covered. Now we need to ask ourselves a few basic questions when we critically review an article. For example, there are quite a few questions, about 10 to 20 questions, but we start with the first thing first, and that is the title. Is the title of the article appropriate and clear? Ideally, the title of an article will include or will reflect the aim of the research, the methodology, and the context, right? For instance, language, learners, motivation, or factor. Okay, I would put it this way: factors impacting EFL learners' motivation in Saudi EFL context. Or if I put it this way, exploring factors that influence EFL learners' motivation in the Saudi EFL context. So when I say exploring, it reflects the methodology. EFL learners' motivation, then it explains the purpose of the research. In the Saudi EFL context, it talks about the context of the study. So these three things need to be there in a clear and appropriate title. Do you understand? If any one of them is missing, then there's a problem. You got the point? Okay, number two, the abstract. The abstract needs to be specific. The abstract should begin with the aim of the research. It should talk about the methodology, the methods, the participants, the major findings, and any recommendations, conclusions, right? It shouldn't be longer than 250 words, right? So if these criteria are met, then you can say it's a good abstract. If any of them are missing, then you can pinpoint the weakness. Is the purpose of the article clear in the introduction? As I said earlier, the introduction should include a statement of the problem. The researchers should identify the problem clearly. They should include the objectives, the aims, the research questions, right? These different things. Any one of them are missing, then you can say it's a weak introduction to the research paper, right? The next thing is the nature of the study. It's a case study, ethnography, experimental design, mixed method study, etc. Uh, this needs to be clearly explained in the abstract as well as in the methodological section of the study, right? The next one is the theoretical framework, and you need to read about it. The difference between conceptual framework and theoretical framework. And if you don't know, well, it's a different topic, and it requires a lot of time and attention. But if you don't know, you can ask your research teacher, the one who teaches you the research method, to explain the difference between conceptual framework, theoretical framework, where it needs to be uh, fit in the research work, and why do we need to have it, etc., etc. So you need to look for the theoretical framework. If it's there, good and well. If it's not there, then probably you have to point out and talk about it in a critical way, right? Then you move to the findings section. Then you find uh, issues with the interpretation. Sometimes the graphs, the pie charts, the tables, they're not properly described, not properly explained. We do have facility of using SPSS and all different softwares. They can help us analyzing the data, but when it comes to interpreting the data, we often make mistakes due to lack of experience or knowledge. So, being a critical reviewer, you have to be careful about that part as well. Then the discussion section. Discussion is a technical thing. You compare and contrast your findings to other people's findings, and you can have your say there in that section as a researcher. So you read that part of the research very carefully to see if the discussion is up to the standards that are set by the experts in the field or not, right? You move from one section to another, like from introduction, then to literature review, then to the methodology. Each section is critically reviewed, and you take your notes at the same time. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, talking about the literature review, it's very important that you consider the cited sources, if all of them are recent, all of them are relevant, all of them are pertinent. Um, the quality of those references is also very important, because if something is published in ordinary journals, there are hundreds of journals that will publish anything, right? If that kind of stuff is cited by the researcher, then you can point it out. The quality of journal is very important. For instance, in a Scopus index journal or impact factor journal, it takes about 12 to 16 months to publish a research article, right? In ordinary journals, like there are hundreds of them around the world, they will that will take you about maximum a month to publish. And those journals basically they lack quality. um, they do it only for business, for money making. So you can be careful in that section as well. Of course, you will be considering the factor of critical and descriptive literature review. I have written an article on this. You can go through it later, how to write a critical review of literature, and then you will see the difference between a descriptive and critical literature review. That one part is extremely important, no doubt, but the quality of the citations, the quality of references, you have to be careful about that as well. Um, Another important point, like if the ideas are overemphasized or underemphasized, you have to be, you know, cautious here. You have to look for uh, over and underemphasized concepts and ideas. Some ideas might be overemphasized, uh, but you would say no, they are not that important. Undue importance is given to those, or space is given to those concepts, right? Probably they would need some revision, etc. So you can find such kind of stuff in any research article that you read. At the same time, you can see that some sections are too short, too brief, others are too expanded. In both cases, you can comment on them and you can suggest changes. Uh, the next thing is about the writing style, the tone. If the writer uh, is using simple language for the readers to understand, because in research we shouldn't use big words, flowery language, because that can lead to ambiguity. So you can comment, especially the last section of your critique, where you can have your own say. There you can comment on the style, the writer's style, and the tone of the researcher, right? To what extent do you think the style was clear and it was formal? Uh, it met the standards of formal writing and research, etc. Right? What underlying assumptions does the author have? And well, a lot of people, I would say, when they do research, they have their personal agenda at times. They have underlying assumptions. They always have something premeditated, and that is basically an important factor that impacts their overall research endeavor, right? For instance, if I believe that online teaching and learning is not a good practice, when I do research, my underlying assumption would be the same, and it would be reflected somehow in my research practice, right? In my findings, you will sense that, well, I believe that online teaching is not a good practice, right? So from there you can decide whether the researcher has an objective or subjective approach when he or she is discussing the findings. You understand the point? So the underlying assumption will determine to what extent the researcher is biased, unbiased, partial, impartial, objective, or subjective. The list of the questions continue, and basic questions. The research problem is significant or not significant in your opinion? Does it contribute to the theory, practice? I did mention this. Do you find the content repeated or duplicated at times? Is the topic too exhausted? One, for example, when we talk about the motivational factors that influence learners here in the Saudi EFL context. So the topic of motivation is too exhausted now. Nobody's talking about these things anymore. It was a very good topic back in 2000, but not anymore. So you have to comment on a point like this as well. You can point out mistakes in statistical calculations, if you're good at that. The procedures of data collection or data analysis, anything that is missing, because that section, according to the editors around the world in big journals, good ones, they believe that the methodology section should be very, very detailed, and it should be explanatory. It should explain everything in minute detail. But it's not the case when we read papers. A lot of procedures are usually missing, and further detail is always needed, right? we talk about the study design, there are always pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of different designs. So, for example, if we pick qualitative methods, the strength is that we can go deep and we can find out people's perspectives, their personal experiences and observations as first-hand information. But uh, the negative thing is that these perspectives are always too subjective and they cannot be generalized. On the other hand, quantitative methods, for example, we take a survey questionnaire as an example. So people take it for granted. They don't spend time thinking about different questions and different items in the questionnaire, right? So the data can be superficial. So both these different methods, designs, they have their own strengths and weaknesses. And we got to be careful about these things when we critically review an article, right? So different questions related to the design of the question, design of the study. Do you understand? Okay, so when we critically review an article, we consider the methodology, a different method, different data collection tools, their strengths and weaknesses. We also see whether the researcher is a fair one, he or she understands the limitation of the method. A good researcher will always acknowledge these things. He or she will say, well, uh, the method has strengths and weaknesses, and he will clearly state those limitations. He will also state the limitations of the research overall. For example, due to cultural uh, constraints, a researcher can only collect data from male sections, from participants in the male's campus, and he has no access to the female's campus. There could be a question mark that why couldn't he collect data from both the sections or campuses? Um, a conscientious researcher will probably highlight both these points, right? And a good research will have this. You need to make sure that the researcher has uh, ethical approval from the university or where the study was conducted, right? Ethical approval from or consent from the participants, right? So if that particular section is missing or the details related to that part, ethical approval part is missing, then it's a very big weakness. You can point it out in your critique, right? Well, common points, but the data can be generalized if the findings are, for example, collected through survey questionnaires and the participants number is big, like 5,000 students or more, then you can say that, well, these findings can be generalized. But in exploratory research or constructive research, where we use qualitative data collection tools such as interviews, semi-structured interviews, the problem we have with those data tools that we can't really generalize the findings. so you can sorry so you can point out these two different factors as well, right? So you will have to ask a question as a reviewer when you write your critique if the findings can be generalized to other contexts or not. You understand the point? Do you have any questions? Okay. So those were some of the basic questions that you need to consider when you critique a research article. Um, Going a bit deep, we can consider some critical questions to critique a research article. And the first key thing is that we need to know the researcher's motivation in writing the work. It's very important that the what point was considered by the researcher, what was his motivation, or what were those instrumental factors that forced him or her to conduct the research. That's very important. And in how would you know about it? By looking at these key points, whether he agrees with something or he goes against it, right? So, for instance, um, online teaching and learning practices. So, from the writing, you can guess whether he or she agrees with this or he or she doesn't disagree with the point. Or they propose a completely new point of view, right? He comes up with something very much novel. And it could be the case that an existing point of view is there, but he or she is adding up to it through his or her research practice. Okay, it could be a case of reformulating an existing idea for a better explanation. The writing style, the tone, the findings, the way they design their research paper, they will tell you about these things, the motivation. What is the motivation of the researcher? Okay, so and the last thing is very interesting. You can bring in two different ideas. You can reconcile two seemingly different points of view and make your own one. Like it's almost like the fourth one, reformulating an existing idea for a better explanation, right? But some good researchers, when they consider two different schools of thought and they bring them together and they come up with their own point of view. So the motivational factors behind the work or the research paper can be seen when you look for these different points in the research paper. Is it clear? Are you there? Okay, very good. So one thing is the motivation of the researcher. The second thing is how does he or she approach the subject matter? What kinds of words, cue words or phrases or expression they use. When you consider these different points, you will understand the approach of the researcher. In a in a quantitative study or in an experimental study, the writer's approach would be different to the one who is doing an ethnography or who is doing an exploratory study. Because in an exploratory study, the writer would be using a lot of words and expressions. But in a quantitative study, there would be, big use of statistics and descriptions of facts, figures, um, the description of different features, explanation of graphs, pie charts, etc. These different features will determine the approach, and from there you can say or you can conclude that the researcher is mainly using a scientific approach, like they call it positivist approach, like those who conduct experimental study or those who collect data through quantitative data collection tools, right? So the description of different sections or the explanation of the theories will help you understand the overall paradigm of the researcher, whether he is a constructivist, believing in qualitative stuff, or whether he is a positivist, right? Some people use mixed methods. They bring uh, both these opposite poles together, and they conduct their research. A lot of people don't believe in mixed methods. They say, or they are of the opinion that quantitative and qualitative, positivist and constructivist, they are completely two different things. You cannot really have them together. But different sections of the paper, when you read or go through them, they will help you to understand the approach, whether the researcher is a constructivist or a positivist, right? The third key question is about the overall structure of the author's work. How do the separate parts fit together? Ideally, there should be a connection between the different sections of paper, and each section should end with the reader's guiding sentence. For example, like the following section considers the methodology, the methods, uh, and the analysis of the results. So a sentence like this, and then a new section is started. So you can see a connection or kind of a linkage between different sections of a research article, right? If that is missing, then I would say it's a weakness, right? So three key questions, critical questions about uh, a research article: the author's motivation, author's paradigm or approach, and the overall structure of the author's work. These are the key things. Okay, so that's all for today about critiquing an article.